So here recently, SEC coaches talked about their expectations for the Alabama Crimson Tide in 2021. And this is something that I really wanted to talk about because these are the individuals that would have the most familiarity with Alabama and the program Nick Saban is running. So with that in mind, let's jump into this. Before we do, as always, y'all know the drill. I want to hear from y'all. Hop down in the comments, give me a why if you agree with these coaches and if you disagree, and then let me know where you disagree if you do. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell notification. I do constant college football content, and you don't want to miss any of it. And if you enjoy that content, be sure to like and comment down below. Those interactions are massive to content creators such as myself. But with all that being said, let's dive straight into this. And there was a theme amongst a lot of these anonymous coaches when talking about Alabama in 2021. And that theme was their defense should be really, really good this year. In fact, one coach went as far as to say that defensively, they'll be one of the best teams in the country with what we think they have coming back this season. Even with the losses the Crimson Tide experience on defense, they have so much depth at those respective positions, whether it's defensive line, linebacker, and the defensive back room. There's a lot of competition with incredibly talented individuals at every single one of those, and I think a lot of people are going to be stunned when they see just how good the Alabama defense is. But some coaches kind of went on to say the only time you can give the Alabama defense fits, and I thought that this was very telling as well. They've talked about how the defense last year was the weaker side of the ball when we talk about the offense relative to the defense. Last year's Alabama offense is ranked up, if not the top offense in the history of college football, certainly a top 5 offense in the history of college football. I mean, that's what we're talking here. So it's not surprising when the defense wasn't also on that same level. But one anonymous coach said the defense was definitely the weaker side of the ball last year. Pete Golding has the hardest job in the country, but he's done better than you think. They do such a good job of forcing you to do things. They're too talented to just line up against. You have to use a lot of formations and motions and just stuff to keep them off balance, which means you're liable to make mistakes, and when you get behind schedule, they pounce. Now, there's a few things I would like to unpack in this right here because there's some things I very much well agree with and some things I find interesting. First and foremost, I think what he means by the very last bit, when you get behind schedule, that's when Alabama just turns their edge rushers loose and say, go get them. And we know what Alabama has packing as edge rushers this year. When you look at the Alabama defense last year, they had one glaring weakness that really kept rearing its ugly head. And that was whenever there was a pre-snap motion or even a running back and tight end coming out the backfield, there was a lack of communication between the linebackers on who was supposed to get what. Many times we saw this breakdown in communication end up in either big plays or flat out touchdowns. For instance, if you go back to the A&M game, the first 2 touchdowns they score are just flat out busted coverages where the linebacker should have accounted for an individual getting the ball, but they didn't. And that right there is something that Alabama has got to shore up this year because that could be a huge weakness within this defense. Now, they have the athletes to be able to cover that. Whether we're talking Jalen Moody, whether we're talking Henry To'oTo'o, and certainly when we're talking Christian Harris. And make no mistake, that was something that the Crimson Tide defense shored up as the season went along. The linebackers got much better at accounting for both tight ends and running backs out the backfield, and when it was clicking, this unit was so good at stopping things when everything was accounted for. And that's something that these other coaches talked about. They said the only time you're able to get the Alabama defense is when you make them outthink yourselves. And that's why I think that a healthy offseason is so important. Last year, I think it was very easy for not only Alabama, but for defenses as a whole, especially defenses that ask so much of those middle linebackers to outthink themselves. I think that's very common last year with a full offseason, with a full training camp, with the ability to coach with some sort of normal continuity. I think that a lot of that will be cleaned up. But now let's talk about what these coaches' expectations were for the offense, because I think everybody expects for the Crimson Tide defense to be incredibly solid this year. When you look at the names on it, the talent on it, this Crimson Tide defense should be much improved. But the offensive expectations were intriguing. One anonymous coach said he doesn't believe there will be a drop-off in Mac Jones to Bryce Young. Bryce Young, incredibly talented freshman, super fast release, really live arm, something we're all excited to see in action come this fall. Another anonymous coach kind of took it a step further when talking about how talented the Alabama Crimson Tide offense is on paper. He said that when you look at what the Crimson Tide lost, it's astronomical, but they weren't worried about the losses on the offensive line. They weren't worried about the losses at running back, and they said that the loss here that they were looking at is Devontae Smith, and that makes absolute sense. When you're replacing an individual who won the Heisman at the wide receiver position, that is going to be a loss that is hard to make up for. Fortunately for the Tide, they have a talented wide receiver room with a really talented quarterback getting them the ball, and when we look at the running back room for the Crimson Tide, this is going to be more of a running back room by committee, something I've talked about, but I think that the ultimate X factor for this offense is going to be the tight ends. Jaleel Billingsley and Cameron Latou, in my estimation, are in for a massive year, and if they are involved in this offense, I think this offense is going to be incredibly proficient. And the expectations around the league from SEC coaches is that though the offense for the Alabama Crimson Tide replaces a lot, they don't think that Bill O'Brien's going to change much stylistically, which is in line with what we've heard from Nick Saban and O'Brien, saying they're going to run Alabama's offense. And in fact, these anonymous coaches think that the Alabama offense is going to be very good, but with a defense that could be top-notch. So it's really interesting to see. Hop down in the comments, let me know what you're thinking. That's it. See ya.